Hello, welcome back to the Young Professionals Math Bootcamp. My name is Mary Beth, and I'm going to take you through Lesson 2, which is Decimal and Fraction Basics. Again, with math, you really have to start at the beginning and make sure you understand the basics before moving on. This will help you so much when you move on to other lessons. The first thing we're going to look at is the slide with decimal place value. What you want to remember with decimals, everything to the right of the decimal is less than 1. So when you look at that little box on the right, I've identified some place value for those numbers. So the 2 is in the ones place, which means think of it like money. It's like $2. Then you have your decimal. The 4 is in the tenths place. So that means it's 4 out of 10, or you could think of it like 40 cents. The 5 is in the hundredths place, so that means 5 out of 100. Think of that like 5 cents. And then you have thousandths. The 6 is in the thousandths place. That is 6 out of 1,000. So you can see the decimal place values, and then you can also see below it some fractions. So we'll work on that as well, changing decimals to fractions. But what you want to realize is that decimals, fractions, percentages, you can move between them. Like I said earlier, if you put a money sign or a dollar sign in front of a number, sometimes it can make it easier to understand. So even if your problem does not involve money, if you find yourself getting confused about place value or what that number represents based on where it is, think of it like money. So for example, when you're looking at this slide, it asks you what is the place value of each number in 45.67. So I just put a dollar sign in front of it. $45.67. The 4 is in the tens, meaning $40. The 5 is in the ones place, which is the same thing as $5. The 6 is in the tenths, so think of that like 6 dimes, so that would be 60 cents. And then the 7 is in the hundredths, so that would be 7 out of 100, or 7 pennies. Because remember, you have 100 pennies in a dollar, so if you have 0.07, then that's 7 pennies out of 100. And so you can see on the right, that's what I just did, is I broke that down. Next, we're going to just go to the board over here, and I'm basically just reviewing what we just went through. Again, this is extremely important to understand and to practice. If it isn't making sense yet, again, when you go back and practice, rework the examples from your homework or from this lesson. It will make it easier to understand. So when I'm instructing this class, I always put this at the top of the board, and I pretty much leave it up the entire session and for multiple sessions. So when I'm going through decimals, fractions, percentages, I always leave this up because understanding this will help you. So again, anything to the right of the decimal is less than 1. So if you have 0.07, that 7 doesn't represent 7 whole units or 7 whole dollars, whatever you want to think of it as. It's something that's less than 1. So in this case, it would be like 7 cents. If I have 0.7, now my 7 is in the tenths place, so that's the same thing as saying 7 tenths or 7 dimes, for example. And remember, too, when you're working with decimals, if you're shopping in a store and you see this on a label, it says 0.70 with a dollar sign, you know that it means 70 cents. If you see the same thing and there's no 0 after it, that means the same number. I could add 100 zeros after this. It's not going to change the value. This 7 is still in the tenths place. So again, just practice placing the numbers in different spots and making sure you understand what each place value represents. So if I have 67.2 2, 3, 5, I have 6 tens, 7 ones. The 2 is in the tenths, so that's 2 out of 10. The 3 is in the hundredths, so that would be 3 hundredths. And the 5 is in the thousands, so that would be 5 out of 1,000. Also remember, the further to the right you go with this place value, the smaller the value. If we're just looking at this, we have 0.2, which is 2 out of 10. If I have 0.02, that's 2 out of 100. If I have 0.002, now that's 2 out of 1,000. So this number gets smaller and smaller. The further to the right you go, the smaller the value. So here on this slide, we're just practicing rounding to the next tenth, rounding to the next whole number. So this first one, we're rounding with decimals, we're rounding to the nearest whole number. So that means if you're rounding to the nearest whole number, there's no decimal point. So there's no decimal point, no numbers after that. And you want to be careful when you are taking a test, doing your homework, to read carefully, because sometimes it will ask you to round to the nearest whole number. Sometimes it will ask you to round to the nearest tenth or nearest 100th. You just have to make sure you double check the questions. So 45.67, think about it if you were shopping in the store and you were just adding this in your head. Is $45.67 closer to $45 or is it closer to 46? Because we're rounding to the nearest whole number, if the number following the decimal is 5 or larger, the number in the ones place goes up. So in this case, 45.67, because there's a 6 after that decimal, you're going to round up to $46. So now we're going to go back to the board and just look at that a little bit closer. So we have 45.67. So again, just to review, you have 4 tens, 5 ones, 6 tenths, and 7 hundredths. And right now we want to round to the nearest whole number, which means we're going to get rid of our decimal and get rid of anything that comes after it. Because there's a 6 after that decimal, this number is going to go up. So this would round to 46. So that's a general rule. If a decimal or if a number is followed by 5 or something more, that number before is going to go up. If the number that comes after the decimal is less than 5, which in this case it's a 4, then this is going to stay the same. 45 is going to stay the same. Again, think of it like money. If you have $45.47, that's a little bit closer to $45. So on the slide, you'll see what we've done here is rounded these numbers to the nearest whole number. So 901.45. There's a 4 after that decimal, so it becomes 901. 85.55, there's a 5 after that decimal, so it becomes 86. 1.501, there's a 5 after the decimal. If it's 5 or greater, it round up to 2. And 1.3, so now you only have a 3. Again, if it's less than 5, that whole number stays the same. So that would round to 1. And again, you want to just make sure that you read the directions carefully and find out, are they asking you to round to the nearest whole number, tenths, hundredths, so on. So the next slide we have rounding with decimals continued. Now we're talking about rounding to the nearest tenths place. So we're going to go back to the board. Same number, we have 45.67. but we want to round to the nearest tenth this time. So nearest tenth. And just to mention this as well, you'll notice how I have the numbers spelled. I have them just written out in, the easiest way is just putting the 10 and then the THS. So when you see that THS, that means it's a number to the right of the decimal. It's less than 1, it's in the decimals place. So be careful not to get tenths confused with tens, because when you're saying that quickly, you don't really hear the THS. But if we're saying nearest tenth, what that means is you only want to have numbers as far as the tenths place. You don't want to have anything after that. But in order to figure out if this stays the same or is increased, you have to look at this number, the number in the hundredths. Again, if this number is 5 or greater, this number will go up. So to the nearest tenth, 45.67 becomes 45.7. So because this was 5 or higher, that 6 becomes a 7. If I have 45.64 and I'm rounding to the nearest tenth, now there's only a 4. This is going to stay 6. So that would be rounding to the nearest tenth. And as far as the way I have the decimals written, it goes on for a lot longer. But as far as building your basic math skills, if you're taking a standardized test, you're probably not going to have to round any further than that, so I generally will stop there. So going back to the PowerPoint, we have some examples with rounding to the nearest tenths place. So 68.22, the 2 is followed by a 2, so it's 68.2. 71.546. There's a 4 after that 5, so it just stays 71.5. 15.66. The 6 is followed by a 6, so that would be 15.7. 16.96. Now that one becomes 17. So those are a little bit extra because there's a 6 after that 9, so that 9 has no place to go except to go back to 0. So that changes that whole number as well. Again, think of it like money. If you have $16.96, that's almost $17. Then finally, we're going to move on, rounding to the nearest hundredths place. So it's the same concept. If you have 1.679 and you want to round to the nearest hundredth, you look at the number that's in the thousands. So there's a 9 after that 7, so that rounded to the nearest hundredths would be 1.68. So again, we're rounding to the nearest hundredths. Because this is a 9, this moves up to 8. If I have 1.624, so I have 6 tenths, 2 hundredths, 4 thousandths. This is a 4 here. That would just stay 1.62. So again, whatever you're rounding to, look at the number after it. That determines if this stays the same or goes up. So then here you have more practice. Rounding to the nearest hundredths. So 42.016 becomes 42.02. That 6 after the 1 changes it to 0.02. 75.679, that 9 after the 7 will change the 7 to an 8. 10.012 becomes 10.01. And this one is similar to the one on the previous slide, 9.999. It has nowhere to go but to become 10. All those 9s will change to zeros. But the reason I still left the 0.00 is because it asked me to round it to the nearest hundredth. So I want to have a number in those two places. I want to have a number in the tenths and in the hundredths. So I keep that 0.00. Again, this concept just takes a little bit of practice. And again, hopefully this lesson, this video will help you to practice this. If you still are getting stuck, you can always go to other websites. YouTube has great tutorials. We also use Khan Academy, which if you go back to that lesson 1 PowerPoint, you'll see the last slide has the codes that we use for Khan Academy. So that's another method you can use to practice. So there are many different tutorials out there online that can help you. Sometimes it's just helpful to see somebody else present the material. Okay, this next slide just explains the relationship between fractions and decimals. So again, if you have the 10th place here, if you have a number in the tenths, that means it's out of 10. If you have 0.06, you have the 6 in the hundredths place, so that would be 6 out of 100. If I have 0.002, that 2 is in the thousandths place, so that would be 2 out of 1,000. And the reason it's important to remember how to do this, how to change from fraction to decimal, decimal to fraction, work with percentages, is because you might have a story problem that shows you all the numbers in decimal form, but then your answer choices are given in fraction form. Or you're given a story problem with percentages, but they want the answer in fraction form. So you want to be able to remember how to translate from decimal to fraction to percent and between the three forms. And then this slide shows you an example of the relationship between decimals and percentages. And we'll go over this a couple different times throughout these lessons, again, because you use them with different problems. If you want to change a decimal to a percent, you simply multiply that decimal by 100, which is the same thing as moving the decimal 2 times to the right. So whether you're simply moving that decimal 2 times to the right, or you take that decimal, plug it into your calculator, and multiply by 100, you're going to get the same thing. What you want to remember is it's 2 times to the right. It does not matter where the decimal is. It's always 2 times to the right. So think of, because percentages are always out of 100. 100 has 2 zeros in it. So just remember that 100 has 2 zeros, which means if you're going from decimal to percent, you're going to the right. So if you have 0.07 and they want you to change it to a percentage, you're going to move that decimal 2 spots to the right, and that gives you 7%. If you have 0.007 and they want you to change 0.007 to a percent, still you move it 2 times to the right, so it would be 0.7%. So don't let it confuse you when you have a bunch of zeros or different numbers. It's always 2 times to the right, or multiply it by 100 when you're going from decimal to percent. So here are just some more examples on the PowerPoint of moving from decimal to percentage. So 0.45, you move that decimal 2 times to the right, and you get 45%. And here are some more examples. So 0.02, we moved it 2 times to the right, you get 2%. 1.5, you move it 2 times to the right, and you get 150%. So think about this too. You know that all numbers to the right of the decimal are less than 1. If you have a number in the ones place, or in the tens and the ones, that's greater than a whole unit. So for example, 1.5 is the same thing as $1.50. So that's greater than 100%. So when I move that decimal 2 times to the right, I get 150%. 0.006, move it 2 times to the right, and you get 0.6%. 0.075, move it to the right, and you get 7.5%. And also, I would practice these on paper, but you can also, with your calculator, try plugging it in. So again, if you have 0.02, and you enter 0.02 times 100 equals, you'll see that you get 2%. So when you're doing story problems, do it by hand, and then try it with your calculator as well to make sure that you're getting the same answer. So I hope that you found this lesson helpful about decimal and fraction basics. In the next lesson, we're going to learn a little bit more about fractions.